Hello and welcome to another episode on CityCast. This is our third episode, and what we're going to be dealing with today is specifically the command or qualification on an elder to be the husband of one wife. I dealt with this in my sermon this past Sunday as I taught about elders and the qualifications of elders. I handled it in a pretty extensive moment there in the service, but I thought maybe it would be good for the podcast for a quick reference on what does this mean to be a husband of one wife. And so I want to first of all start off just by reading the actual text to you when it says at the very beginning, it says, this saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. And then it goes on into some other qualifications of an elder. So what does this mean, the husband of one wife? Because this has been a super confusing thing in many churches. I remember being in a church, and obviously that same qualification is of deacons, and they held that a man could not be divorced and serve as a deacon in that church. Now, to be fair, their role of deacon was more like the role of an elder, but nevertheless, they had this restriction on this man that he could not serve as a deacon because he had been divorced before. And so what does it mean? What does it mean to be the husband of one wife? Also debated among this, one thought in this verse is that what this passage means is that the man must be married. Right? Like if he's the husband of one wife, that means he has to have a wife. And so one restriction that some churches put on to elders and deacons, particularly because of this qualification, is that they must be married. Now, I think that's a difficult translation here, primarily because this is a restriction that Timothy most likely, we believe that he was single, and Paul as well was single, that neither Paul nor Timothy could then be an elder in the church. That makes this kind of a hard pill to swallow. Also, if Jesus couldn't be an elder within your church, then is the role functioning as it should actually function? So I think it's hard to say that this means that you must be married. It also flies in the face of Paul's encouragement to those who can be single to be single, for that is what is better for the kingdom. And so if that is what's better for the kingdom, to be more and to be able to be more godly in that way, how then could that role be restricted? And that be what this means? I don't think that's what this means. Hand in hand with that, I've actually heard a criticism of the elder position that they also must have more than one child, because as the passage goes on to say, that he must manage his household well. He must manage his children well. They not just child, but children must have more than one child. And obviously, I think that is a poor restriction as well. I think what Timothy's point here is that if you are married, you should be the husband of one wife. If you have children, you must manage them well and have them be submissive to you. And so I don't think the restriction is that you must have a wife and you must have more than one child. Another interpretation of this husband of one wife text is that it's restricting polygamy. And that's probably actually my second favorite interpretation of the passage, because I think it could lend itself to a belief in that. But I also find some problems with that. I think it's a tough translation. Interpretation of the text, because it seemed like that was obvious, that the early church was against polygamy. And also, it doesn't seem like the early church or Judaism in this moment had particular struggles with polygamy and needed to have that restriction placed upon them. And so I think that interpretation, again, falls short of the mark as well. Another interpretation is that man cannot have been divorced or cannot have been remarried, and so in that, what that interpretation is saying is he's the husband of one wife, meaning that he's only ever been the husband of one wife. And so again, I believe that's a tough interpretation for a couple of reasons, particularly with divorce. Paul could have used the word for divorce. There was a Greek word for divorce. And if he wanted to be clear about, I don't want an elder to be divorced, he could have used that word, and he doesn't use that word here. Second, when we're talking about remarriage is not prohibited in every circumstance. Like later in this letter, Paul is going to encourage widows to be remarried. Now, obviously, they're not in the position of the elder, but it doesn't seem as though remarriage in the right circumstances is something that would lead someone in any position to sin. And so I think that's a tough interpretation of the text. And then thirdly, this list of qualifications that Paul is giving on the elder are all present character issues. If this was about divorce, or this is something about a past decision, it would be really the only qualification that isn't dealing with the present character of the man. And so I think it's a tough interpretation to say that it's about divorce, that a man can't have been divorced, and he has to have been the husband of one wife in that instance. Now, let me be clear. I think there are some parameters around divorce and remarriage. There are biblical reasons, permissible things for divorce. Now, obviously, God hates divorce. We should fight against those things as much as we possibly can. But obviously, there are some biblically permissible reasons for divorce, marital unfaithfulness, abandonment, some different things like that. And so there are biblical measures that allowances for divorce in that way. And in those cases, also remarriage. I think there's also some merit to looking at where that person, were they a believer? I think it matters that they were a believer, and in their believing life, how has their marriage been, right? And so I think those are some important qualifications when it comes to divorce and remarriage. And I think it's a tough interpretation on this text that he is the man of one wife being about divorce. Now, what I think is most accurate to the context of the letter is that the elder will be faithful to his wife. You have to remember the context there in 1 Timothy. Paul is writing to false teachers who are leading particularly women astray, rich women astray, and there seemed to be some sexual misconduct among the church at that point. Also, he's writing to Ephesus, and Artemis, the temple of the primary worship there in Ephesus, was a temple that had a lot of pagan sexual acts for their worship. And so in Paul writing this, he's saying, hey, you should be above reproach. Your reputation should bring a good name to the church. And one of the ways in which you're going to do that is by your sexual faithfulness to your wife. And so I think most accurate to the text is that he would not be a promiscuous man. He would be a faithful man to his wife. He would not commit adultery. His marriage will model the relationship between Christ and his church. And so I think that is what is most important especially when you're talking about the qualifications of a pastor, elder, is that man should exemplify faithfulness to his wife. He should live, not perfectly, of course, but as an example of what it looks like to be married and to love Jesus. And so he should, as Ephesians 5 goes on to say, love his wife as Christ loved the church. Well, how did Christ love the church? Well, he gave up his life for the church. And so that husband, all husbands are called to this, but particularly an elder is called to faithfully love his wife in such a way that he would die to himself, lay down his life for the sake of his wife, and to serve her in a way that honors the Lord. And so I think that's what's most faithful to the text here, that he would be a husband of one wife. He would be faithful to his wife, and in so doing, bring great reputation to the church and live above reproach in that way. Thank you for joining me on CityCast. God bless you. We'll see you at the next one.